Welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm excited you're here. If you don't know me, I'm Joel White. I'm a lover of film, music, reading, stories in general. I'm a filmmaker and an actor. And if you don't know this about me as well, I'm a huge J.R.R. Tolkien fan, big Lord of the Rings fan. And I've been steadily throughout my life been working my way through his works. And I wanted to talk today about the story of Kullervo, which honestly I hadn't heard of really before until a couple years ago when I bought this book. It's been on deck for a while. It's been on my reading list for a little bit, but I finally made my way through it. Want to talk about it. Also, just like want to talk about this cover for a second. For one, red's my favorite color, so I'm already in. But I just love when a color has like texture and then just cool design and art. So obviously Tolkien didn't design the cover art, but he painted this. And they put the full painting on the back. And I love that they incorporated that, and they did it in a very artistic way, even at the top here, as you can see there with that image. It's just a beautiful jacket cover. I love the way it looks. It's very short, and here's the thing. I'm gonna do my best to avoid spoilers, but this is also not really a complete story anyway. And it's also based on the ancient Kalevala legends. Kalevala, yes, Kalevala legends that are like a kind of Finnish in origin. So I'll do my best to avoid spoilers. It's a little difficult because it's very small and he didn't even finish. But that's also kind of the interest of this book to me. This mythology was something that really influenced Tolkien while he was in school. And from the notes and the commentary presented within this book, there's a high probability that these stories heavily influenced him while creating not only Middle-earth, but even the Elvish languages. He used a lot of inspiration from the old Finnish language to develop a lot of those things. The way that this book is structured and presented is very interesting. It obviously has like an introduction, and then it presents to the best of its abilities the old draft of his version of the story of Kullervo, who is the son of Kalervo. And basic plot synopsis is that Kullervo is killed by his brother, who I believe is called Untamo, and Untamo enslaves Kullervo's wife, and while she's enslaved, she gives birth to twins. One is Kullervo, the protagonist, and his sister, his twin sister, Winona. I believe in the old stories, she doesn't really have a name, but Tolkien gave her one. Winona, I believe, means weeping. I believe Kullervo means like wrath or pain, something like that. You'll notice as you read through his story and then through the notes and commentary, he took some liberties and made some changes, but still stayed, I would say, pretty true to what my understanding is of that original story as it's presented here. I haven't read the original story all the way through. There are also some essays in here that he wrote that were, I guess, maybe not 100% sure that he gave as lectures, but we think pretty sure he did at some point. But it's interesting for him to write out his fascination with these stories, and the fact that what the version he read, I forget who translated it into English, but he didn't apparently find it to be a good translation, so he rented a Finnish grammar book to try and read it in the original language. And you'll have to forgive me, this is all, like, I just read this is all very new to me. So if you're more familiar with this mythology and more familiar with Tolkien studies and what influenced him here, feel free to correct me in the comments. Just please be nice about it. I'm not trying to mess anything up. I know we all love Tolkien. We don't want to misrepresent him. So even though he was trying to read it in the original language, I think from what I can understand from what he wrote, and as well as from the commentary and the notes, is that it's not that he didn't enjoy the translation in terms of the story and being presented with this new world and these new characters. It's just that he was a philologist. He was very much into language and the way certain languages are structured and how they have certain sounds and how you're supposed to intake something within a language. So understandably, he had a pretty good grasp on language because he studied so much that when something is translated, sometimes it's not that we can't have a comprehension of like what the story is, but because it's a different language, we're not receiving it the same way a native speaker would in that language. Whatever the case, he still found the story very fascinating and wanted to attempt to retell it himself. So it's interesting as you read through this, because you get to read his version of the story that abruptly ends, and then you also get to kind of see a draft of plot points that he made of like, you know, this character's gonna do this and this character's gonna have this name, you know. So he still had a structure for kind of where he wanted to go with it. It's just he didn't get to fully flesh it out. So it's still neat that even though it abruptly cuts off, you still have an idea of where he was gonna go with it, and at that point it's left up to your imagination. It obviously would have been very interesting to be able to read the ending if he were to ever have finished it, but obviously we don't have that ending. In his essays, it's very interesting to read his reasons behind why he was so enthralled with these stories, because they're not your typical heroic, oh, like let's go slay the dragon characters. They're very tragic, they're very fragile, but they're very human. Honestly, I think that's one of, I don't know if I would say the main reason why he liked it, but I think it was way up there for him. The fact that these heroes were not presented as like perfect, essentially. So there's a relatability, but at the same time, it is quite fantastical. Very much filled with magic and powers and primordial, you know, beings and spirits. It's presented here, at least by the editor of this book, Verlyn Flieger. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right. The way she presents it is that he was very much interested in kind of pagan and mythological things at that time, because I believe at this time it's not that he had, I don't think, renounced his faith, but he was in a frustrating situation where he was forcefully separated from Edith, who would be his future wife. And supposedly at that time in his life, his faith wasn't as strong as it had been, and he wasn't as consistent about keeping up with it. That being said, it's just interesting to note the time frame of certain aspects of his life, the things that influenced him during that time, and what happens after in terms of his writing and his own mythology. And I think that was another thing that he found very interesting about these stories, was the way in which we have them. Again, please forgive me if I am wrong about this, but from my understanding was that these myths were primarily passed down through like poetry and song. They weren't written down for like quite a while, actually. They're very old, they're very ancient stories and myths, but because of the Finnish bards and the singing that they do culturally, people memorize the songs and the heroes and the characters. And then I want to say, like early to mid 1800s, someone collected the songs and wrote them in the Kalevala in Finnish. I believe that's how it all goes. Feel free to correct me. But from that point, then not too long after is when we got our first English translation of these stories. So Tolkien obviously was very fascinated by mythologies of multiple cultures, stories in general, and great characters, and the fantastic and things like that. It's not surprising that this would stand out, especially when it is markedly unique from a lot of other mythologies and how tragic the heroes are. It's not that there aren't tragic heroes in, say, something like Greek mythology. It's just that they're presented like, it's hard to explain, like almost a childlike way. Not in the sense that they're strictly immature. It's just so imaginative, and there's no like pretense of I can or can't do this with this character. It's very much instinctive. There's something, I believe, in one of the notes or the commentaries that points that out as well. Actually, I think it might be one of his essays that he wrote, that the way that the bards would sing these songs, it was almost as if they were making it up as they went. It had that kind of fire to it, and that was some of the imagery I think he used in some of his wording, was that it was like this living thing that was being formed kind of like as it was being written or sang about or said. So yeah, it's wild and it's not normal, but there's just something unique about it. There's something that in the deepest parts of who we are, we can imagine or think about in a way that precedes our notion of how we structure the world, you know, as we grow as adults, and how we see it like this is that means that, this does this thing. It's like, well, no, this in the Kalevala can actually do this thing, like trees can talk, or, you know, maybe the grass or your sword can talk. You know, there's a sprite or a spirit or a dryad or a naiad for like anything and everything, and there's a relatability. I think even beer in the Kalevala can sing and talk about how great it is. It's very, very interesting stuff. So to me, this was a surprise. It was cool. It was very, very unique to me as well. And you know, I think almost with Tolkien as my guide, in a way, he was able to draw me in to the wonder of it all. Because I think for some people, they could be easily put off by how tragic and how dark and how sad it really can be. But I think for some people, I don't know if I would use comfort as the word, but there's some level of maybe assurance or acknowledgement in stories like this sometimes, because some people have difficult lives. Some people go through very difficult things. Maybe not on this scale, because there's a lot of tragic things, but still, it's this idea that, you know, life goes on and that life is still actually wonderful and there is beauty around you, even though things can seem dark or tragic. I'm not gonna try and dive into that too much because I feel like dig myself a hole in complexity and just trying to make something make sense that is difficult to make sense of, and I don't want to confuse anybody. Like, I'm not saying tragic things are beautiful necessarily, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. But just this idea that stories matter, stories mean something to us, and that there can be kind of all kinds of stories that can be powerful. And I think it's quite obvious, as pointed out in the book, in the notes, in the closing chapter written by Verlyn, I don't know how you say it, I'm sorry guys, that the Kalevala and the story of Kullervo heavily influenced the creation of Middle-earth in general. And Kullervo as a character is essentially the inspiration for the character of Turambar, the son of Hurin, and his tragic story. So if you've read his story, you'll notice real easily a lot of similarities. They are different. He did change things when he brought it into his legendarium, but you can easily see how Kullervo would have inspired Turin. And that's an interesting thing about this whole process of reading the story is, yes, he was attempting to retell myths and legends, but it also inspired, at least in part, his own legendarium, because referenced several times in this are quotes and ideas that Tolkien had throughout his life of like language is myth and myth is language, and how you can't really separate the two, and how there's this idea, I believe he even said in one of his essays about it, of like what makes you want to write something or start a story or try to emulate it. And it's kind of this idea, can I do that? Like, I kind of want to try, like, what if, I wonder if I can do something like that. So it's like, I don't even think when he read this, like, oh, I'm gonna write The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It was just like, oh, can I retell this? Like, can I do it in a way that would capture new readers? And I think from then, it just, things keep stacking on top of each other, right? The more he studies language, the more he reads stories, the more he gets into myth. It was just a natural process that eventually, obviously, gave us what we have today. And in his essays about the story of Kullervo and the Kalevala, he touches on the fact that, and I think he did it in other writings, especially in letters, and I think that might be part of where I'm getting it from the notes of his letters to other people, that he was dissatisfied with the lack of mythology of England. Not that there weren't any myths or legend concerning England, but I guess just a more fleshed out, more realized story concerning the origin of the world. Because a lot of these other things like the Kalevala or the Poetic Edda, the Volsung Saga, you know, and other nations, a lot of them have their own kind of like beginning of the world aspect to them, that it's like fantastical and different from our world, but it's not. And again, there's more that could be said about that, and I'm probably butchering some of those concepts, so once again I apologize. But that was something that he attempted to do with Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is essentially, it's Middle Earth, but it's a mythological history of England, you know, and I think we forget that, or maybe we don't know that, because we get so drawn into the world and the characters of like elves and dwarves, and we know that, you know, we don't have these fantasy creatures walking around us. But it's something to take note of, that this was definitely a part in the influence of creating Middle Earth and creating that mythology and that history for England that for us obviously is a bit more modern, but has, as we can see, it has outlived him already and will for a long, long time. And that's so interesting. I think can be a difficult concept sometimes, because we have all this technology, we have all this information at our fingertips, and we can read history, you know, from this place, from that place so instantaneously. But this idea that he's following the tradition of myth makers, of storytellers that, you know, is so ancient. And I just think that was such a cool endeavor and an amazing attempt, because it might not have worked. Like, he's obviously a brilliant writer, but if no one enjoyed the stories, if no one bought into the world, if no one liked the heroes or the characters that he created, could have been easily just, you know, on a handful of bookshelves and never to be heard from again. It's just neat to know the history of those things. So hopefully I didn't stray too much from the actual talking about this. I know I was kind of bouncing all over there, but a lot of that, like I said, is incorporated into this book. These ideas of where Lord of the Rings came from, what the story meant to him, and how, in a way, even the character of Kullervo he identified with on somewhat of a personal level. There's a little bit of conjecture there, but the premise of why he would associate himself with Kullervo, and obviously not fully, the idea that he would identify himself or relate to that character, at least in some capacity, to me makes sense. I'm not gonna just go through all of that right now for the sake of not having a super long video, and for the sake of hopefully not butchering that and allowing you to kind of come to your own conclusion about that if you were to read this book. But for me, it would make sense that he would identify with that character, at least in some way. That being said, I really enjoyed this book. If you're a Tolkien fan, I highly recommend checking it out. I would say it is a little bit more scholarly, obviously because of like the notes and the commentaries and things like that. Also because he wrote it very young and he wrote it in a very different style. That's a bit more Shakespearean. He has more these and thous and hath and all these things. It's not too difficult to follow though, and because he was doing something to try and emulate the original Finnish language as well, it is very lyrical, it flows very well. So I found that to help in the reading process. The style might be a little different for you. If you have read a lot of Tolkien, you may struggle a little bit there, but I would just say keep reading and you'll fall into that flow quicker than you think. So it flows well once you kind of get going, and then the notes and the essays and the commentary are just, to me, very fascinating, especially if you're very interested in myth, story, legends, Tolkien in general. I think you'll have a good time reading this book, so highly recommend you checking it out. So that's my review of The Story of Kullervo. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, if you liked the discussion, if you enjoyed the dialogue, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. As always, guys, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you guys in the next video.